Watch me like my head go over the top of the camera. Yeah, apologies to whoever ends up watching this because you won't be able to see my head. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 arguments in this speech. First, sector-wide unions are better at campaigning for rights. Second, this empowers and allows redistribution to the more vulnerable and less well-funded occupations who, under that side, would be left alone to form their own unions that lack resources. Third, large unions are more diverse and more accountable. First, on why unions are better at campaigning for rights. There are 4 parts to this argument. The first is that they're better at doing large-scale actions, things like strikes or negotiations or enterprise bargaining agreements. There are 2 premises I want you to note in the start of this argument. First is, these sector-wide unions are going to be extremely large for 3 reasons. First, empirically, just have a lot of people. There are vastly more numbers of people when you bring together multiple occupations. Second, companies tend to employ both groups of people. That is, they don't just employ electricians, they often employ electricians and plumbers in one large umbrella firm. Or, for example, Foxconn does not just employ the people that put together the iPhones, they also involve people that are doing things like technical design, doing things like getting the resources up from the ground. So, it's easy to recruit people because they know and see each other and because you can campaign in the same workplace. Third, there just tends to be more interaction. That is, people often in the same sector but different occupations spend lots of time together. Teachers spend lots of time with principals. So it's very easy for one person to recruit many members from different occupations. That explains why these unions are very large. Second, note that the problems that unions face, or the problems that sectors face rather, tend to be common. Rather than there being specific problems faced by one industry or one occupation, they tend to be faced by everyone in the sector. Why? 4 reasons. First, I just make the empirical observation. You would rarely read about, say, an electrician-specific problem. You read about things like enterprise bargaining agreements or award wage changes or things like injury compensation or pay reform. Those things affect entire sectors as a whole. Second, it's because the world is very globalized, which explains that exogenous shocks that hurt specific industries are rare. Most of the time, those exogenous shocks hurt all sectors at once. Third, there's just more government involvement in unions' life these days. That is, the government does things like the accords or setting award wages, which means unions collectively or sectors collectively fight against government action. Finally, companies just tend to be very large. They tend to cover multiple parts of supply chains, which explains why these problems are likely to be common, because struggle against that one individual company is likely to involve struggle by multiple people in different occupations. So, why do those 2 premises? Given those 2 premises, why do we get better at campaigning on doing large-scale actions? 3 reasons. First, you just have more numbers. That is, there are more people at the picket line. You have more strength of will. If you threaten to withdraw from negotiations, that means far more damage to the company. Second, you can cripple companies because often companies can replace one part of their supply chain. That is, they can get one sector of manufacturers to come in and get scabbed for, or they can do things like import from another company, maybe at a higher expense. But if everyone in your company is striking, or if multiple different sectors of your supply chain have broken down at once, you probably don't have the capital buffers to deal with that. You don't have the time to coast while you get in negotiations, which explains why you have more power over companies. Third, more powerful unions, as I'll expand on more later, will ally with less powerful unions. That is, the less powerful occupations, those with less resources that are less unionized, are able to be supported by those that are more unionized or have more powerful people in them. So, large-scale actions are far better under side on. Second, service provision is better, and there are 2 broad reasons for this. First, obviously as a corollary of the former argument, there's more funding for things like resources when you have more people in the unions. But second, economies of scale, because most of the time, the things that you need to provide services for on a day-to-day are things like lawyers or therapists, and all those kinds of forms of support are things that are not specialized for any occupations. A principal's therapist does not need to be different to a teacher's therapist. Obviously, when you have economies of scale, you can do things like hire better ones, do things like hire more of them, give them more resources, more ways to look at every single person's contract. That is obviously incredibly meaningful. Third reason you're better at campaigning for rights. There's better institutional knowledge, and this takes 2 forms. First, you know how to fight and support one another. That is, one union that has had a particularly successful strike campaign in the past can pass that institutional knowledge on. No, they can even be on the strike line with the other occupation. Obviously, that kind of institutional knowledge is incredibly important. But second, multiple parts of the supply chain are reflected in one union, which is really important because often companies cover that part of the supply chain. So, knowing how they work from top to bottom, from the most influential people to the least influential people, is really important. Third, finally, you just have a lot. Often you can allocate time more efficiently. That is, if sectors do have unique problems, if there's one particular thing that affects one sector, say for example they're fruit pickers and there's seasonal affection in how much fruit picking happens, you can devote more time to that occupation when that occupation needs it. And when it needs less time, maybe the season has changed, you can spend more time on someone else that needs help, which is why you can allocate resources better. You have more allocative efficiency. That explains you're better at campaigning for rights when you have a sector union. Before I move on, I'll take opening. Closing.
Yeah, if it's the case that unions are like occupational based, like wouldn't it be the case that like it's a symmetrical benefit that like writers will strike with directors because like they need each other to like coexist, so they'll strike together?
Okay, a couple things to say there. Firstly, that symmetricises the debate massively. If you want to stand by these two unions working together and strike at the same time, you presumably stand by them sharing institutional frameworks. Why not just combine them into one? But second, as I'm going to explain in my next argument, you have far more solidarity between unions at the point where you can combine them into the same institutional frameworks when the same people are working for them, when the same union reps are representing both groups of people, when you have things like day-to-day interaction over the union coffee house, which allows you to do things like get close to your fellow workers, even though they might be actors and you are writers. Obviously, those kinds of cross-class, cross-occupation solidarity happen far better when you're actually working together. So, second argument, this empowers the most vulnerable occupations. This is directly responsive to their attempt at preemptive mitigation in RPM. So, why are there a set of unions that have less power? Number of reasons. They could be less well paid. They could be, for example, less unionized. So some unions, some occupations have more unions. Or, for example, they just might have less support. They might be things like more marginalized workers. Why do those unions get redistributed to from the more powerful unions when they're in sector unions? For the reason that, four reasons actually. First, the union staff tend to be shared, so the union staff might not necessarily correspond to one occupation each. Those union staff can share their resources, they'd likely force redistribution. Second, you share time and energy, like on the picket line together or in the break room together, which means you do things like develop solidarity. Third, you have an incentive to make your union stronger, so more people join it, which is why you're going to support even the weakest parts of your union with more resources. Finally, you do just have like kind of legal responsibilities to represent those workers. That explains you get redistribution from the more powerful occupations to the less powerful ones under side opposition. Final argument, very intuitively, why larger unions are more diverse and more accountable. Firstly, on accountability, three reasons. You have more institutional frameworks. That is, you have a more hierarchical established system, which means you can do things like facilitate cooperation, tell when corruption happens. Second, insofar as there are different power groups within the union, they hold one another accountable, they call one another out when they do bad things, that allows them to keep each other accountable. Third, because you are bigger, there's more scrutiny. That explains that unions are far more accountable under side op. That means you do things like get more support from the public, from politicians. Finally, more diversity. The observation that I'll make here is very simple, which is that some occupations within a sector are extremely male dominated, others are extremely female dominated. Look at the way the textile industry works. If you're the one woman in the male dominated part of the textile industry, it's important that your union also has women in it. Perhaps there are women from other occupations, but your struggle is the same. You can share and collaborate resources together. That is obviously incredibly important. The biggest unions are the ones that have empirically won the most change. Clearly, we all stand behind them.
Leader of the opposition for that speech, and to continue the debate, I invite questions.
One big push on this speech, just that mobilization is far easier and effective on our side, but before that, just a few notes of framing. First, we just think that it's possible to co-opt many of the benefits provided by us by opposition bench, because if it is true that there are problems that impact entire sectors, and that means that they all need to strike together. We do support multiple industries within that sector, or multiple occupations striking together, such as the Actors Guild and the Writers Guild in Hollywood currently having a strike together. We think that that's something we can also co-opt on our side, and we think that our benefits, which are more specific to the needs of specific occupations, are mutually exclusive in this debate in a way that their benefits are not, because they haven't told us why it's less effective to just go on a co-strike with another occupation that happens to be within the same industry if you are suffering an industrial-wide issue. So on why mobilization is easier on our side, we just think that it's quite true that disparities do exist within sectors. They try to assert to us that you have problems that just impact every single person within that sector in the exact same way, but we just think that this is untrue, because first, wages can be incredibly different within a sector. For example, within the film industries, directors have a more stable source of income compared to actors and writers within that industry. industry, and we think that that's a form of disparity that happens that might mean that you need an occupation-specific union. Secondly, we just think that payment schemes can also be different. For example, in the service industries, like for example in America with the tipping culture, that payment scheme is incredibly different from the way managers within the service industry are paid, and that means that the concerns of waiters within that industry are completely different from those of managers who once again have a stable source of income. Thirdly, we just think the issues that you're exposed to are vastly different. For example, your job specifically can be more dangerous. As a waiter, you are in a lot more threat in your job context compared to a manager who's always safe and like in that context. And so it's just completely asserted that you just have industry-wide issues that can all be solved through a sector union. And we think that those disparities become quite important because their side is simply more prone to disagreements and have lesser chances of unionizing and actually going to strikes. Because first of all, they need the needs of one occupation once again are conflicting, can also be conflicting with those of another. That is to say, if a waiter goes on strike or they waiters want to have a strike, the managers might be quite opposed to that within that context, and we think that that is a massive point of disagreement on their side. We think that strikes happen at the point where things become threatening to people's existence and become things that they view as existential threats within that context, and we think that that just simply does not apply in such a large-scale union, because we just think that strikes entail not making money for a very long duration of time until you actually go to negotiate with, the overseeing body, and many people don't take that chance unless they think that something is deeply wrong, something is impacting their lives in such a severe way. And to the extent where we've proven to you that there are quite severe disparities within that union, we have no idea at what point that union decides to go to strike, at what point people have so much empathy and decide to give up their wages for those of their co-workers in order to strike. And we think that that is something that they have to deal with on their side, because they just tell us that you have greater redistribution because you develop solidarity with your workers and things like that. But at the point where you have to go on strike, which means not feeding your family, which means things that you don't actually meet your basic needs in a way, in some ways, they just have a way reduced likelihood of strikes. I'll take that point.
Even if your material here is true, the vast majority of unions never go on strike. Why does that material not affect things like redistribution or things like service provision, which is the day-to-day business of unions?
We just think that in terms of redistribution and service provision, we also have things like that. We think that is also quite hard in terms of solidarity, and we think that it is prone to the same issues in terms of preferences of certain occupations, which goes into our next point, which is that their side is just more susceptible to internal sabotage, because we think that at the point where you have those things in terms of service provision and redistribution of assets and things like that, and they have a hierarchical structure, we think this does not make it easier to call each other out. We just think that it makes it more so that the actions within the union just become more prejudicial in terms of the bases which they target and the people who they actually want to redistribute assets to and things like that. Because first of all, we just think that you might have a higher likelihood of higher prices within that union for registration fees and things like that. Wait, before that, do you have a POI closing as well? For engagement. Okay, cool. The higher prices to union registration and things like that, or prejudicial prices, because we think that when it comes to, we think that since it's a proposed motion, they don't have the power to say that this simply won't happen, and that's how actually argue about the likelihood of people who are more preference within that sector actually wanting to redistribute assets and things like that. And so we think that in this instance, we just think that first, it is in their interest to make their own job easier. They want to reduce the ability for people to strike, to have better work conditions or things like that in order to be benefited within that position. And we think that that can mean that they reduce their access to registering, their access to the union itself in ways that are incredibly prejudicial in terms of the registration fees and things like that. Lastly, we just want to discuss the idea of the most vulnerable actors within that union. Because at the end of the day, at the point where we've explained to you that because of the massive disparities that exist within sectors, the fact that they say that you would campaign and redistribute attention to one specific sector, to waiters, for example, as the service food industry, we think that that was incredibly unlikely for all of the reasons that we provided to you. The fact that this actually actively harms managers within that industry. This actively harms the ability for day-to-day functions within that massive industry. And in the cases of let's say say Hollywood with the Directors Guild, who are not threatened at all by automation or artificial intelligence in the ways that threaten the Writers Guild and the ways that threaten the Actors Guild. We think that that means that these people never end up actually having any sufficient bargaining in terms of changing the conditions, because at the point where the changes advocated for by the writers and the actors, who when they are separate are able to actually advocate, go on strike, go on post-strikes together in a way that harms the Directors Guild but is beneficial and equitable and incredibly necessary. We think that this is what makes changes for entire industries and protects the most vulnerable workers. Never been prouder to oppose. Vote OPO.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. I invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to conclude the opening up.
My sister works in gardening and landscaping, and when she got injured at work, she didn't go to the gardening and landscaping union, she went to the forestry and parks union, which also includes lawnmowers and loggers, people who come up and decide which plants, to plant in the first place. And they were able to allocate her, a young female lawyer like herself, who understood her problems, and when they were allocating her to a therapist as she was entitled to based on her workplace limitation, they were able to do the same thing. And the unique reason for that was because they had a sufficiently large economy of scale to be able to employ diverse people to provide services to the people who work in the industry dominated by men, in which the problems that are faced are often just problems of discrimination, and that is particularly important. We were the side that made unions more diverse and more accepting of diverse groups of people. That is the debate-winning harm. Why? Firstly, it does just have a colossal impact on minority workers because it unlocks labour rights for them in a unique way when they're more likely to do the way up of paying union fees because they feel accepted and are not likely to be ignored by that union in the first place. But secondly, I would just point out that oftentimes when the question is how much you participate in unions, people from minority backgrounds, for example, people of colour, often just suffer from racism in unions that are dominated by white people. That is a harm that we avail to some extent by allowing them to bond together within the sector union as opposed to the more narrow occupation one. But thirdly, this also improves the overall perception of unions, which is often one which is particularly majoritarian, that is particularly bad and has particularly important flow-on for the effects. Diversity is clearly debate winning for opening opposition. The next thing I'm going to talk about is problems for specific industries. A few things to say here, because I think opposition have got this the wrong way round. Because the first observation that I would make is the important factor in determining whether or not you can get change for specific industries isn't whether the union itself has an incentive and capacity to do that, but it's whether the company that you're negotiating agree with that. Like, clearly it is obvious that the sector union still cares about getting change for the various different groups in their industries. The more pertinent question of whether or not you can produce change is whether you can get the companies to agree with those changes in the first place. It is just like on intuition more believable that the company would be the one who is disagreeing than the union being the one who is disagreeing with the workers' rights, which suggests already that this argument is subsidiary to our material, which suggests that negotiations with companies get better. But second observation I will make is just like oftentimes the problems are the same. Like opposition's examples about directors and writers. In that case, it is obviously true that the Directors Guild would also want the writers to be paid more. That is just true. It's not the directors themselves who are paying the writers, it is the film company. Clearly they all want to work together. Clearly that is something that can happen better when they are in one union for all the reasons we tell you, because it is more effective when you have the set of people who are all striking simultaneously. But thirdly, I would just note that their mechanisms for why larger unions will lack expertise and specificity are a little bit shoddy, because it is intuitive that these larger unions have both incentive and capacity to cater to the more niche and specific problems in their industry. Firstly, just because they need and want members, so they cannot afford to have them disillusioned in the way the opposition would claim. But secondly, obviously the people who are high up in the unions making the decisions are people who have dedicated their lives to helping people for not a very high-paying job. Those are clearly like the type of people who do care about writers and directors and everyone else in the union. But thirdly, we say it's specifically better under our side because you have a larger union, which you, no thank you, reallocate resources. So for example, when a particular employer, for example, if a particular electrician, if a particular company is being particularly harsh on electricians, you can at that point allocate all of the resources union into focusing on that one. Or for example, if there is a prominent asbestos scandal in a construction industry, the construction sector can then dedicate all of its resources to fixing that specific problem, so we get more effective at targeting the specific problems. But lastly, on this, weigh it, because even if you do believe that opening government is better at fixing the specific problems, we would always rather the more general things, because I think it is true that the more prevalent problem, if you are a construction worker, is not do you have the best possible working conditions as an electrician? It's how much are you getting paid? How much are you getting paid as compensation for the labor that you do? Do you have enough people to feed your family? Do you have disposable income to do the sorts of things that you want to do? What industry-wide problems are clearly the most important ones. Those are clearly the ones that people in unions and unions themselves care about. That is clearly debate winning. Before I move on, I'll take closing if you have anything.
Yeah, most nurses are women, most doctors are men. Doctors bring in more resources to the union because they pay more percentage of their wages dues. It's the same percentage, but their wages higher. So won't women be forced out of competing in this allied health workers union because they represent less?
Yeah, that is exactly our argument. Having more doctors in the union because they have more negotiating capacity also helps the nurses. And I just want to deal with this right now because this was your other POI, which suggests you might just have the unions strike in parallel. But obviously, firstly, that is less guaranteed. You would rather just have a scenario where they work in the one union so they have an incentive to help each other out, because then they know the doctors then know that when they go on strike, the nurses will help them as well. But secondly, obviously, in the first thing you POI, you do just miss out on the shared services. Next thing I want to talk about in terms of just why it is better to have larger unions is why it becomes far easier to recruit people. That clearly feeds into the much larger benefits we tell you about more negotiating power, which are the ones that clearly determine this debate. Firstly, weigh the importance of the network effect in recruiting unions, because the question of whether or not you join a union is one of whether or not you perceive that the cost of the union membership is outweighed by the potential benefits that union has to you. And obviously that is something that is way more likely to happen when your colleague who has, for example, had an injury tells you the union treated me really well. And obviously the reason that is then better for our side is because colleagues from different industries often work together or in the same workplace, which means they are more able to talk about and get more people in the union. But also the economies of scale means, and all of the resource sharing stuff, which means you have a lower cost for unions on the outside, means you can lower membership fees, which gets way more people into the union because that calculus is way better. That strengthens our argument. The next thing I want you to do is heavily weigh the material about services, because we would actually say the times when unions go on very large scale strikes are actually quite rare, and that's intuitive, right? It's very difficult, it's often costly, it's a big risk, you don't know if you're going to get it. But the most important thing in this debate, and the role of the union in the modern context, is providing services to the people in the union. That is why people join in the first place. That is a constant benefit, and that is also one that applies to people when they're at their worst. When they get injured or harassed at work, the union is then able to support them and step in the intimidating and deeply stressful legal battle against an employer who is much more powerful than you. That is clearly the most important debate. That is clearly something we get better for the reasons we've already explained. Last thing I want to do is just explain why this argument is far, far more impactful in the developing world. And I will just want to note that the context of this is one way in which unions are, first of all, just often illegal, and therefore they face a unique and specific restriction, but often are just the main political activist groups. For example, leftist parties are often aligned with unions. It is much better under our side. Very, very proud to oppose.
I thank Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech, and to open the closing half of the debate, I'm Mcharo.
what does change actually occur from these unions? What do they actually need to do to be able to get this change, to be able to get these benefits that both sides in opening tonight have tried to tell us that we're going to be able to get from the various forms of unions? They get this through actually being able to threaten their employers with going on strike, with saying you're not going to be able to continue providing this service, producing this product. It's going to impact your revenue. It's going to impact your customers. You need to give us what we want or we will strike. We will interrupt your operations. That is a lot easier to do and a lot more effective to do if you actually have a union that can go on an effective strike, that can get everybody within that union to be able to strike, to just completely not go to work because they all care about the issue and because they are all a small centralized group that is able to go on strike as a whole, that is able to create these big impacts on a specific area that causes the specific change that they want. Two key aspects of this extension, firstly around like more potent unions and that we're able to get unions that can provide more precise and extreme change, and secondly around how we're better able to reach the customer through these strikes of these smaller unions, of these occupation unions, so that we're able to get these changes and have these strikes actually be effective because they're actually going to impact the customer. Just briefly, how this differs us from opening, firstly through further mechanisation, and secondly through how we're actually impacting the customer, how we're going to be actually having these effects and actually creating this change. Onto the more potent unions. We think firstly that if we've got everybody that's within the same union, if you've got everybody that's in the same union that's doing the same issue, they're often going to firstly have the same education background. They're going to be trying to get towards the same level of the same wage because they've gone through the same sort of training. They're expecting the same starting wage. They're expecting the same conditions. They're working in very much the same environment, and they care very much about the same issues, as opposed to if we've got everybody within the construction industry doesn't necessarily particularly have the same environment, same issues, and things like that. And we're able to have everybody within this union actually caring about these issues that are going on, actually caring about what's happening, and then for actually caring enough to be able to strike and to so if we take, for example, if we have like the midwives union, they would not nearly be as effective if they had to, instead of just being able to go on strike on their own, had to get all of the doctors, all of the nurses, all other healthcare professionals to try to go on strike as well, because they simply do not have the same requirements. They simply do not have the same issues. And we also believe that within these areas, if we've got different careers, different groups that are getting paid differently, as Taav'n's already brought up within a POI, if we've got the doctors that are all getting paid significantly higher wages than any of our nurses, it creates an incentive for the union to prioritise those that are able to be paid more, to prioritise those that are able to fund the union more, and therefore prevents them from being able to prioritise the needs of those niche needs of just the nurses, of just the midwives, and creates incentives there for them to not be able to prioritise these smaller groups more, to not strike for them as well. And also, if we're able to have smaller unions or smaller unions that focus on the specific careers themselves, it makes it firstly easier for them to organise and go on strike very immediately. It means that it's easier for them, extending on what we've heard from OG about how it's easier for them to mobilise, it means that they're able to, instead of having to wait for months to organise a strike, to be able to do all of this internal negotiation and all of this organising and negotiating with the other groups. If the nurses all want to be able to go on strike and they've instead got to concede requests that the doctors have also got additionally, so that they can actually get the union to mobilise and go on strike, but instead of getting the extreme changes and the extreme benefits that they want to get, they've got to bargain with the other aspects of the union. They've got to bargain with the doctors and everybody else within the union. They lose out on the effects that they want to gain. They lose out on the specific things they want, and it makes it a lot longer and a lot harder to get any change, to get any effectiveness. And we think that from this, if we've got unions that are actually able to be more effective, able to mobilise faster, able to represent the specific group, instead of getting into this politics and this factionalization within the different areas within these larger unions that are focused on, and I'll take you in one moment, that are focused on an entire industry, we're able to get more people wanting to join their union and more people wanting to join the union for their specific career because it specifically represents them instead of trying to represent an entire industry, instead of them having to join the union and then worry about what all of these other different types of construction workers care about. They can join a union that specifically represents them, that specifically represents their types of interests, and as they see it's being more effective, they're going to be more likely to join these small unions, going to get more people. I'll take opening, sure.
We explain that workers of different occupations are united by a shared struggle, their time spent together, and their labour representatives. Why is that less important than the fact that they might not have gone to the same school or might not do the exact same thing at work each day?
Because we think it's important for the union to be able to have a specific motivation to work with and just support the people that are within that specific career. And we think that further, if you've got a group of people within the union that have one level of education, a group of people that have another level of education, and they're expecting different levels of resulting wages when they join, they're joining at different ages, they're joining under different conditions, they're going to expect different results. And as has already been conceded by opposition within a POI, we believe that it's just as easy for these unions to be able to just cooperate and strike together if the need arises and if that's something that could be beneficial to them, and instead we don't see this sort of factionalization that we see within larger unions. We don't have to worry about this internal bargaining that is just going to make things less efficient and mean that we end up with less potent and less effective change because they've got to make compromises with other parts of the union. So very quickly, how do we actually better reach the customer? Because we're able to get more effective strikes, and we're able to get faster strikes, and we're also able to get strikes within a specific career. Instead of having a couple of different workers from different careers all striking at the same time, we're able to get all of the workers within a specific career striking, taking out everybody within that career and actually creating really immediate and large-scale change on anything that that sort of career produces, because they are able to all strike at the same time. We're able to have bigger and more scaled impacts, which is going to better reach the customer because we're preventing that service. Very proud to propose.
I thank the Member of Government for that speech, and I invite the Member of Opposition to continue the debate.
So far, this debate has been about the action and the power of each individual kind of union. The way closing opposition are going to fit into this debate is by explaining, first of all, why it's likely that these larger sector unions are more likely to exist in the first place and be maintained in periods of pressure, and second of all, to explain why individual union action is actually harmful to every other field of employment, taking on a higher burden than our opening by explaining not only why they're not as good, but why those kinds of unions are actually bad. Before that though, a little bit of sneakiness, we're actually going to explain why industrial action is good, because no other team explains why this is something that's necessary. The average reasonable voter doesn't inherently believe unions are necessary. Both teams want to have why unions are good. We're actually going to explain why that's the case. First thing to explain here then, why businesses and governments have an incentive to remove the rights of workers. This is because quite simply, they have a profit incentive and a profit motive to keep costs as low as possible. The way this is normally done is by not giving good enough wages to workers, by taking holidays away from workers. That's not giving good enough training to them. This means that they simply don't have enough money or good quality of life to do things like feed their families, pay their rents, or in general, just enjoy the lives they live. We think this is incredibly important in this debate, because if you don't have unions that are active and unions that are good, you just simply don't get good conditions for these workers. But secondly, this constricts the power of companies who, probably have malicious incentives, especially perhaps in the developing world, because they make more money when they exploit workers when they're represented by unions, and this means that they can rival the power of governments through large amounts of lobbying, through being able to control kinds of policies that they're doing. This is especially bad for things like environment environmental policy, all that's to explain that unions are probably good. This is like, I don't know, something that wasn't really touched upon in this debate. I think that probably gets us ahead, instantly. The other two extensions, though, have a little bit more meat to them. First of all, explaining why individual strikes are actually bad for other kinds of occupations in the industry. On the frame of this argument, we explain, as I said in my introduction, why this is why this is an actively bad kind of union, which knocks out the entire government bench, and also explains better than our opening why these are actively bad. Three things to explain here. First of all, the success of an individual employment union hurts the material conditions of other occupations in those sectors. Businesses do not want to increase their costs and they don't want to reduce their profits. When union action succeeds, both of those things are pressured to rise. The way they resolve this is they remove the conditions of other kinds of employment in the sector. That is, explain to you at opening, how these perhaps companies have many kinds of employment inside of a sector. It means that when one of these kinds of employment get better union outcomes, it's far more likely they just screw over the other kinds of employment. They perhaps don't increase their wages to the rate of inflation, perhaps they don't give as many holidays, and perhaps they just generally make the conditions for these workers far worse. This explains that even if you believe all of this analysis on government as to why these individual unions are super good, you should also believe that the businesses have an incentive to make the conditions of all other kinds of employment way worse. So all of their benefits actually flip to a harm, especially to the most vulnerable kinds of employment, because they don't have the capacity to represent themselves as well, meaning that all of their benefits actually turn into a harm. This more or less takes out the government bench. But second of all, I'd like to explain to you that it actually becomes way harder for these aggrieved kinds of employment to correct this failings from the businesses, because as soon as one business or at least one sector in one union in a sector succeeds, there's a huge incentive for businesses to reduce the ability of unions to make any change. Because first of all, they have seen that unions are successful. This means they're willing to break up unions when they exist, make it harder for people to join unions, and lobby governments in order to provide less union support. Because second of all, the people who are working in these bad conditions probably don't have the political and social and economic capital to take time off work or generate a bunch of support in order to do things like strike or do things like collective action to resolve this injustice that's been inflicted upon them. But third of all, the social pressure that's been used in order to get change to the first kind of employment probably won't translate back over to them. That is, people like, I've solved the healthcare crisis because I've helped the doctors. And this means even if the nurses are getting screwed over, people simply don't care as much because they feel like their obligations have been fulfilled. Third thing to explain here is that this actually undermines the initial success of the first union. Because first of all, this is a huge principle of violation. Because if you're a member of an occupation in an industry, you rely upon all other kinds of occupations within that industry. Otherwise, the whole thing crumbles. This means if you're profiting off the oppression of those other kinds of employment, you as a union member who presumably cares about things like, the quality of wages, have had your principles violated. That's probably bad. This is an argument we're going to bring to you. Second of all, there's just simply higher anti-union sentiment, which means that the power of that union that was initially successful is likely to go down because people observe that the quality of life of workers have actually decreased as a result of the success of these unions, meaning that far less people are willing to buy into them. And third of all, we'd explain to you that labour is simply going to be taken away from the successful part of the sector and put into the least successful parts of the sector, the ones that weren't able to protect their rights and the ones that weren't able to defend their interests. This means that this kind of occupation is simply going to get less work, employ less people, therefore all the benefits aren't going to accrue to the successful party. All that analysis explains that even if these individual unions are super good and super cool, they actually suck for everyone else. Before I move on, I'll take opening.
Yeah, so the benefits to raters with unstable wages by far outweighs whatever nebulous impact it might have on the salaries of managers, which is probably none. How do you deal with this?
Wait, okay, so if there's an increase in the salaries of wages, we think managers are going to have a huge incentive to decrease costs elsewhere, because it's really good for them if there's a higher profit margin. This means they're just going to reduce the payment of the kitchen cooks or whatever. It's a very simple analysis. Businesses are motivated by profit, they want to cut costs. Very hard to rebut that. Alright, moving on to our next extension then. Why are these large sector unions are far more likely to exist and persist? This fills an analytical gap that we get from our opening opposition, because if these kinds of sector unions absolutely rule, there's a huge incentive for people to shut down these unions. Businesses don't want really good unions to exist, and they're likely to pressure governments in order to do it. We're going to explain to you why they can survive this pressure, and therefore why these unions can exist in the first place for all of the benefits of opening opposition to accrue. First of all, when the goals of individual unions are met, it is far more likely that these people in the occupation are going to leave. This makes it far easier to remove and delete these unions, because there is some cost of being in a union. And if, for example, your nurse union has gotten
the things that you wanted from industrial action, it's incredibly likely you're just like, these costs aren't simply worth it to me anymore, and leave. This means that their union is going to be far less stable and far weaker. This means that they're going to, reduce their material conditions over time, and new union needs to be formed. This is pretty bad if the people have to exist in the time in which the union power is depleted. But second of all, I'd explain to you that because there's actually a huge amount of there's a huge incentive to be in the larger sector unions, because there's a larger amount of political capital for them, which makes it far harder for businesses and government to crack down on them. Because first of all, there's more people, which are harder to target with intimidation. Second of all, there are more resources to oppress people who are being, attacked by business intimidation, because, some people lose their incomes, but all the other peoples can simply support them. Third of all, more votes are against the kinds of removal of rights to to unions. And fourth of all, it legitimizes unions as a social movement, because more people are in them, they appear stronger, their rights are more likely to get represented. Because we explained to you why industrial action is good, why sector unions are more likely to persist, and why that the individual unions cause an active harm, closing opposition are ahead in this debate.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech. Good play of someone's best on that someone.
Speaker, let me just reshore up our extension, exactly why we provided a unique contribution to government case, right? Why on the bench, we got the brief claims from opening, but while ultimately this was mechanized and further cemented and protected, thanks to closing contribution. And then after I do that, we'll deal with the other teams in the case and opposition bench as a whole. It was largely on the same ball as well. All right, so our extension, right, provided more engagement on the average, right? It justifies and provides the analysis on exactly why, under our side of the house, we got more engagement on the aggregate, which is to say that, on average, more people in a profession will engage with the union, will engage with union activities, and will be more incentivized to be a productive element of bargain action, right? Which is to say that if I'm only advocating for the interests of midwives, I have a higher percentage chance. I have fewer people to target and convince to get on the side of the bargains that we're trying to reach, right? Which is to say, I have fewer people not only to reach, but I have more people who are going to be more engaged because they're going to feel more represented, right? The entire opening half, no thank you, the entire opening half completely disregards that it's probably the case that if I constitute 25% of the voice in a group, right, that I probably feel more represented, I'm probably more engaged, I'm probably going to offer more novel contributions, and I'm probably going to feel more incentivized to contribute more, to donate more, to be an active member of participant of ongoing lawsuits, maybe industrial action challenges, all of these elements that are crucial elements of the services that unions provide, right? Bargaining is the centerpiece of a union, and we never actually got, no thank you, a response from closing on exactly why it's not the case that we got more engagement on the aggregate for these individuals in these professions. If there is an opening POI, please I'll take it now.
Both closing teams exclusively engage with strikes and negotiations, which we explain are very rare. Why should that weigh against our material on service provisions, which is the vast majority of what unions do, and the reason people join in the first place?
Yeah, so it's just not true, right? So Tiarna came out and told you about midwives, right? Midwives have unique working conditions that are just not comparable to other nurses, right? Which is to say that there are unique working conditions that are exclusive to midwives, and this is the same for other people in the allied health profession. For example, if you're one of those elderly or disability care workers, which is to say you work casual hours, you don't work in a hospital, you don't work with with peers, you're usually a solo service provider, which is to say you have one-on-one interaction with the customer for like 8 hours a day, or maybe it's 4 hours a day with multiple customers. These are unique challenges that face exclusively this individual, right? Or exclusively this cohort of individuals. It is not fair to simply lump them in with like all allied health professionals and to say that like all of their interests are collective, all of their interests are the same. This is pretty much like what we get when we're explicitly warned, for example, in this competition against making broad generalizations, which is to say you're basically doing the profession version of like generalizing and saying like, oh, all people of color want the same thing, right? So it's easier if we just get them all in the same group and we just get them to advocate for the same thing, which is not the case, right? Like interests diversify, incentives diversify, and obviously that will translate into like demands and bargaining like objectives diversifying. So it's obviously easier if you have multiple points of attack across a business, across the government, and across like industry standards to say, hang on, is it closing? Yeah, in a minute. It's obviously better if you have multiple analyses to angles of attack against like what did I say? Industrial action, industrial standard, governments and corporations. If you have multiple angles of attack, it's easier to draw benefits, right? It's easier to draw more specific, more niche benefits, especially when we get into careers that are like uniquely niche, but also uniquely like important to society. Which is to say, like suppose I'm an engineer in a nuclear reactor, right? Like the job that I provide is like super duper important to the world, but how many people are like in my sector, like other engineering workers, but how similar is my job to the people that works at the coal plant? Like probably not very high. Like we probably don't incur like the same harms in our workforce. We probably don't incur, like our day-to-day work probably looks nothing alike. I probably went to university and got a bunch of degrees, right? Whereas the people at the coal-fired power plant, whatever, like they probably don't have as many degrees, or if they do, they're probably totally different degrees that cost them different things, and that they go for different reasons, and they probably have different economic mobility, and they probably have different incentives, and they probably have different applicability of those qualifications in the future. Which is to say that to like lump us in the same group is just a total disservice to what I need, to what I have to do, and to the like incentives that I have. However, if I'm in a cohort of exclusively other like nuclear engineer reactors or like nuclear power plant workers, will say, I'm more incentivized to become a more active and engaged participant in that process. Closing?
Let's take your best case and say there's no change for the occupations in the minority of these sectors. On closing, we explain to you that there's an actual harm to them when all of the other occupations are in individual units. Why doesn't this instantly outweigh your entire...
Yeah, so we did hear this analysis, right? That like, oh, if I'm a nuclear engineer reactor like person, and then I get like a success in industrial bargaining, this will like mean that like the rest of the industry will like suffer because the costs will be cut, right? We actually find that this is incredibly unlikely. So we get this claim, we don't really get it mechanized. We get told, oh, governments and corporations have a profit incentive. True. However, they have a profit incentive, but they also have like a bunch of incentives which were wheeled out first at opening and we like re-solidified at closing. I don't know why like we didn't get it, sorry. Yeah, so like there are other incentives, and those incentives include not wanting people to not wanting people to go on strike, not wanting people to like file lawsuits against you, not wanting people to like advocate for higher degrees of like industrial work protection, right? There are other incentives that exist to pretend that the profit incentive outweighs like your incentive to have like, I don't know, engineers show up to work. Like that's just a total like non sequitur. We think it's like hugely bad faith to pretend that like that incentive doesn't exist. We think that incentive is like sufficiently like borne out by the fact that like, oh, you know, openly brought us this content. Tiarna brought us this content on like why it's important to reach the consumer and why industrial action is such a huge threat to demographics of customers. So now just deal with the teams like consequently. On OG we hear, I'll do off bench actually. On the question of like, they want better campaigning. They think that like we will like get less powerful jobs more represented. We brought you this content on midwives. We brought you this content on unique and highly niche professions, like I just did in multiple examples, right? That like ultimately you need like tailored targeting bargaining. That you don't get that under op bench, right? Because ultimately you're just going to be like outswayed. Tiarna brought you the content on like factionalism, which is to say that like at the point at which you're doing like meta bargaining, like to get your thing on like the demand list, that is like an incentive to you because it takes away from your time, it takes away from your efficiency, and it takes away ultimately from the results that you get at the end, which is to say that if you have to go to government with a list of concessions, like a list of bargains, but like most of them have nothing to do with your profession, you have no investment in them, you don't want them to see, like you have no reason to want them to succeed, that is to say that you have a better chance if the list of demands is highly niche, highly tailored to your profession, and that like you can sympathize with all of the demands on that list, or at least a majority, right? So like, yeah, like at the end of the day, your profession was better off, and therefore you were better off because you, at first, are a member of a profession, then you are a member of a sector. That was why we got that. On the question of more diversity, we addressed this in a POI pretty briefly, but it was basically that we don't actually see more diversity over bench.
or like the diversity we do see is like hindering other diversity. We take out CO on the question of like, you know, success benefits one and like harms the others. And then, yeah, we took out OG.
Thank you, Governor, for that speech, and to conclude by opposition.
The frame that wins us this debate is to realise that it didn't only occur in places like the US, like Australia, and like the rest of the liberal West. Our extension proved why larger unions can survive pressure and in times of obsolescence exist when they have more members. In areas of the world where unions are not universally supported, when they are viewed as a relic of a communist past, when they are not supported in instances of which they are not uniquely and solely necessary, the outcome of this is that in those instances, these unions will cease to exist, and it is only the larger ones, the ones that are industry-wide, the ones that have the amount of members that survive, niche industries and the unions of which that exist in those instances never last, and we think that's why we won this debate. Because at the end of the day, to action any of the benefits that any team wanted to talk about, these unions still have to exist. The first question I'm going to ask is, can a large union represent all people in the union? Because I would note this is kind of the crux of both of the cases we hear on government bench. Because opening government tells you that they don't know, they are unable able to focus on the specific needs of the people involved, and then they say that they don't know what everyone specifically needs and you get less buy-in. I would note then closing gov says some may be derivative but also new analysis, which is to say why you get more specific strikes and you get faster strikes. Opening government suggests they have an incentive to help everyone in a larger union, to keep them in the union and to achieve benefits on shared issues. I would note some more reasons why this is true. The first thing that we'd say here is usually there are strong job representatives within a union to talk to hear you out. So notably, if you are involved in, for example, a union that helps all people in that work in a cafe, there is someone who notably will hear your concerns as a waiter, you will be able to talk to and will be able to give you specific help and will be able to promote your benefits to the people at the top. And notably, they have a specific incentive to do this because it gets them power within the union itself. So they will want to represent your beliefs and make sure that everyone else understands it. The second thing I would note here is that unions will act in smart ways. They are far more likely to be able to convince doctors why nurses' concerns are important and why specifically they should care about this and why you get more buy-in. So in the instance of differing opinions, when they are all integrated into the same union, it is far more likely that the union of which is integrated gets more change and more support from people elsewhere. The third thing we'd also note is it's also unclear why strikes have to be organised by everyone to get everyone involved. And I would note some empirical analysis here, which is just to say Sydney Transport has union workers from all aspects of the transport grid, but the train strike when necessarily the buses don't have to. It's unclear why the analysis ever existed on a government bench, which is to say, all people within a union have to act in the same way and strike in the same instance. This is never necessarily true. It just means when the train strikers are able to strike under the one union, they get the support and the funding of everyone else in the union whilst attempting to achieve their own benefits. This is just to say the connections exist at the top, the funding exists at the top, and you get the same service provisions, but it does not say they always have to act in the same way. It is unclear why they are not able to cater to many people at once, and I would note this analysis just kind of deletes both government benches in this debate. Why do we beat closing government? The first thing that they say is that you essentially get less buy-in in unions because the union represents them less. I would note the first thing is that this is not necessarily true. And why is this? The first thing that we'd say here is that most people join the union because they want the specific service provisions that opening opposition would say. It's unclear why them not being their inability to strike as well is the thing that necessarily means they don't join the union in the first place, because they still want to join the union to get access to the lawyers and get access to the therapists that exist in this debate. So it's unclear why that is the tipping point to join the union. The second thing I would note here is people are often people who are willing to strike will probably join anyway because they specifically care so much that they are willing to stop working and get less money, that they care so much that it's unclear why the slightly less catering that they get in a larger union is the thing that becomes the tipping point for them not to join. So these people are also still joining. The third thing I would note here is that my prior analysis explains why they do get cared for and they do get represented. And obviously, I would suggest that our extension explains why the union must exist for them to join in the first place. But even if you believe individual unions are more successful at catering for their specific needs, this is an example that this is not necessarily in and of itself a good thing, because it takes money away from the people who are not better off. Because we told you in our extension why the benefits that some niche industries get means that other people are worse off, because it means you transfer money to the people who are in the union that is successful. And we would note the unions that are successful are often the ones that are stratified by privilege, because these are the people who are able to charge more money for them to join the union. These are the people who have access to more social clout, like comparatively being a doctor instead of a nurse. These are the people who have access to better lawyers. These are the specific unions that are going to be more successful in the end, which means that when the specific union that you support, your niche union, is actually good, it means that the people who are less privileged are worse off. If we take opening government's framing, we are the only side that explains why we get to hit the most vulnerable people in the best way, why we support them the most, and that's why we won this debate. I'll take closing.
With what's your concept on why interfactionalism within like a union plays it to being ineffective, and why this is usually occupationally based? Can we get some engagement with that?
So you're saying why there's disagreement within the union. I think it's likely that they can work together. I think I already explained that. Moving on. Why do we beat OO? I would note their case works to prove why unions work better when they are larger. The first thing is there's kind of a missing analysis as to why unions being better is actually a good thing, which is not something that the average reasonable voter necessarily believes, and we explained to you. So that should win us the debate, probably. The second thing I would note is our contribution outweighs theirs for two reasons. The first is that we take a higher burden in this debate. They say that they make unions better, and that's all good, but we explain, however, that in the absence of industrial unions unions actively harm everyone else. No, we tell you why the niche unions are bad, as opposed to just assuming that these ones are comparatively better. And this neatly gets around the entire opening clash that exists in this debate. Because whether or not they are more successful at solving your specific issues, we told you why the industrial union in of itself is a better thing. The second thing we do is we told you why unions still exist in the end of the day, and notably, not every country in the world has strong union culture, especially in areas with strong aversions to things like links to a socialist past. We prove why, when they're bigger, they are able to last in the long run. They have more access to members, and when members leave in the good times, they don't instantly collapse. This is logically prior to all other analysis that exists within the debate, because obviously you must think that the union still exists for any actions, any benefits to be actualized. The third thing, why do we beat OG? Quickly, I'd say their contribution is about targeting specific needs. We already responded to that.
I thank opposition with that speech, and all speakers for a very strong debate. Please not applaud their hands.
Sacrifice.